Hey everyone, just a quick reminder. Only about 25% of you watching are subscribed to the channel. If you're enjoying the content, hitting that subscribe button would really help the channel grow. And while you're at it, smash that like button too. It helps a ton, and lets me know you're enjoying the content. Thanks for being here, and let's dive into the story. When I first saw the Facebook ad, I thought it had to be a scam. One night cleaning gig in Times Square after New Year's Eve. $500 for 8 hours of work. Sounded way too good to be true. But there it was, complete with a legit-looking company logo and a website link. I clicked, half expecting my computer to catch a virus. But instead, I found an application form. Fast forward a week, and there I was, 27-year-old Daryl, standing in the middle of a conference room at some off-brand office space with 20 other folks. We'd all signed up for what sounded like easy money, cleaning up after millions of drunken revelers. It was going to be messy, sure, but $500 was worth a little trash duty. The group was a mix of people, some college kids, a couple of older folks who looked like they'd seen way too much of life, and me. I made small talk with a guy named Ben, who looked like he could bench press a small car. He joked about bringing a flamethrower instead of a broom. Might be the only way to get rid of the smell, man, he laughed, and I joined in. Right before we headed out, a wiry guy with a clipboard strode in. His name tag read, Steve, but his face screamed, "I haven't slept since the 90s. He clapped his hands for attention. All right, folks, listen up. Before we send you out there are some rules you must follow. These aren't optional. You don't follow them, you don't get paid." That got everyone's attention. Steve pulled out a sheet of paper and cleared his throat dramatically, like he was about to read the Declaration of Independence. The rules. If you see someone in a full suit sitting on a bench, ignore them. Do not approach and do not make eye contact. If you hear whistling and no one is around, head back to the group immediately. Stay out of the alleyways no matter what you hear or see. If your name appears on the digital board by the main cleanup station, check in with me immediately. The room burst into laughter. "Is this some kind of prank?" someone asked. Ben leaned over and whispered, "What is this, a haunted house job?" Steve didn't laugh. "I'm dead serious. Follow the rules and you'll be fine. Ignore them and, well, don't ignore them." That should have been my first clue to bail, but $500 was $500. We got our gear, brooms, dustpans, trash bags, and those neon safety vests that made us look like budget superheroes. Spirits were high as we walked out onto the eerily empty Times Square. The party had ended an hour ago, but confetti still fluttered in the cold wind, and the smell of beer and regret hung in the air. "Man, this is gonna take forever," Ben said, eyeing the mountains of trash. "I should have brought a bulldozer." We all laughed and got to work. The first hour wasn't bad. People swapped jokes and stories, and I even caught myself thinking, this isn't so bad. Easy money. But then, as the night crept on, the jokes started to fade. The streets grew quieter. Too quiet. Around 2:30 a.m., the novelty of picking up sticky cups and soggy confetti wore off. The temperature dropped and the silence of an empty Times Square started to feel oppressive. It was like the city itself was holding its breath. Ben broke the tension with a loud, "Hey, who wants to bet how much gum I can scrape off this sidewalk?" He held up his scraper triumphantly. $5 says you can't get more than a handful," I shot back, grateful for the distraction. "Man, you're on," he grinned, crouching down to start his masterpiece. The banter continued until someone let out a nervous laugh. "Hey, is it just me, or does this place feel weird?" "Dude, it's New York City at night," another guy said. "Weird is the default setting." I was about to agree when I heard it. A faint melodic whistle. It was the kind of sound that would have been charming during the day, maybe from a street performer. But in the dead of night in a nearly deserted Times Square, it sent a chill straight down my spine. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, scanning the shadows. Ben looked up from his gum scraping. "Hear what?" "That whistling." He shook his head. "Probably just the wind." The whistling came again, closer this time. It wasn't random. It was a tune, like someone was walking down the street casually whistling, "Auld Lang Syne." A girl named Jess froze mid-sweep, her face pale. "That's not the wind," she whispered. The group fell silent, all of us straining to hear. The whistling stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the rustle of confetti in the wind. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure in a full suit sat down on a bench about 20 feet away. "Daryl, you seeing this?" Ben asked, his voice low. I nodded slowly. The guy looked like he'd stepped out of a black and white movie. Pinstripe suit, shiny shoes, even a fedora. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands resting on a cane, staring straight ahead. "Rule number 1, Jess hissed. "Ignore them. Don't make eye contact." "Wait, this is real?" Ben whispered, his bravado evaporating. No one moved. No one spoke. The guy on the bench didn't even twitch. "Let's just keep working," I muttered, trying to sound calm. My hands were shaking as I picked up another piece of trash. We moved further down the street, putting distance between us and the bench. Every time I glanced back, the man in the suit was still there, as motionless as a statue. By 3 a.m., the group was quieter, the earlier humor replaced by nervous tension. Jess stuck close to me, while Ben kept looking over his shoulder. "Man, this is the weirdest job I've ever had," he muttered. I was about to agree when the whistling started up again. This time it was louder, like it was coming from right behind us. I spun around, my heart pounding. No one was there. "Okay, that's it," Jess said, her voice trembling. "I'm done. This isn't worth $500. Before anyone could stop her, she darted toward an alley. "Jess! No!" I shouted, remembering Rule 3. She froze at the edge of the alleyway, staring into the darkness. "There's something back there," she whispered. "Don't!" I yelled, but it was too late. She stepped into the shadows. The rest of us stood frozen, waiting for her to come back out. Seconds ticked by, then minutes. Ben started forward. "We can't just leave her." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. "Rule 3, stay out of the alleyways." He hesitated, his face torn between fear and guilt. "We can't just leave her in there." A loud crash echoed from the alley, followed by a blood-curdling scream. Then silence. No one moved. "Jess?" Ben called out weakly. Nothing. The digital board by the main cleanup station flickered, and I felt my stomach drop. My name had appeared, glowing ominously in bright red letters. "Daryl," Ben whispered, his eyes wide. I stared at the glowing letters. Daryl. The sign might as well have been flashing "Dead Man Walking." Ben nudged me. "What happens when your name shows up? Do you know?" "Not a clue," I said, my throat dry. "Maybe it's a prank," he offered weakly. "Yeah, and maybe Jess is having a tea party in that alley," I shot back, trying to mask my fear. I took a deep breath and headed to the main cleanup station where Steve was standing. He looked even more strung out than before, his eyes darting around like he was expecting something to jump out at him. "You saw the board," he said, his voice flat. "Yeah," I replied. "What does it mean?" "It means you're the lucky guy who gets to follow me now," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "Follow you where?" Steve didn't answer. He just started walking, and I had no choice but to trail behind him. The other workers watched me go like I was walking the plank. Steve led me to the center of Times Square, where the giant screens still flickered with leftover ads and the occasional burst of static. The streets felt impossibly empty, like the city itself was holding its breath. "Look," Steve said, turning to me. "I'm going to tell you this once. Whatever you see, hear, or think you see, ignore it. Just keep sweeping. If you run, you're dead. Got it?" "Run from what?" I asked, my voice shaky. Steve didn't answer. He just handed me a broom and walked off, leaving me alone in the middle of the square. At first, nothing happened. I started sweeping, my eyes darting around, half expecting Jess to come strolling out of the alley, laughing about the elaborate prank she'd pulled. But then the shadows started moving. It began subtly, a flicker here, a ripple there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but soon, the movements became impossible to ignore. Shapes slithered across the ground, darting between trash piles and under benches. I gripped my broom like a weapon, sweat dripping down my face despite the freezing cold. One shadow stopped right in front of me. It was humanoid but wrong. Too tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It stood there for a moment, studying me with eyes that glowed faintly red. My instinct was to run, but Steve's words echoed in my head. If you run, you're dead. So, I did the only thing I could. I started sweeping again, pretending the thing wasn't there. My hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped the broom, but I forced myself to keep moving. The creature followed me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. Just sweeping, I muttered to myself. Just cleaning up some trash. No big deal. The thing leaned in closer, its breath ice cold on the back of my neck. I wanted to scream, but I kept sweeping. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it slithered away into the darkness. I barely had time to catch my breath when I heard Ben shouting, "Daryl, help!" I turned to see him standing near the alley Jess had disappeared into. He was holding a trash bag frozen in place as a swarm of shadows writhed around him. "Ben, get back here," I yelled. "I can't move," he shouted, his voice cracking. The shadows began to climb up his legs, wrapping around him like living ropes. His broom clattered to the ground as he struggled, but it was no use. "Rule 3, I screamed. "You shouldn't have gone near the alley." "I was just trying to find Jess," he cried, his voice muffled as the shadows engulfed him. Within seconds, he was gone. No scream, no final words, just silence. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. 2 coworkers gone in less than an hour, and I still had no idea what was happening or how to stop it. The digital board flickered again, but this time no names appeared. Steve's voice crackled over my walkie-talkie. "Daryl, you're doing good. Keep following the rules, and you'll make it through the night." "Steve, what the hell is going on?" I demanded. But all I got was static. After Ben disappeared, I didn't move for a long time. My legs felt like lead and my mind was racing with every terrible possibility. I couldn't stop picturing those shadows wrapping around me, dragging me into whatever void they had taken him and Jess. But the clock on the giant screen in Times Square reminded me I still had nearly 4 hours left on this nightmare shift. I clenched my broom like it was a lifeline and forced myself to keep moving. The others had scattered, sticking to their corners of the square. No one was talking anymore. The walkie-talkies were eerily silent. I caught glimpses of some of them sweeping robotically, heads down, like they were too afraid to acknowledge anything around them. That's when I saw him again, the man in the suit. He was sitting on a different bench now, but he was just as still, just as wrong. His head tilted slightly as I walked past, and I swore I could feel his eyes following me, though he never turned his head. "Don't look, don't look," I muttered under my breath, forcing myself to focus on the ground in front of me. But then he spoke. "Daryl," he said in a deep, velvety voice that sent chills down my spine. I froze. He wasn't supposed to know my name. "Daryl, come sit with me," he said, his tone so calm it was almost hypnotic. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but I remembered Steve's warning. If you run, you're dead. Instead, I gripped my broom tighter and kept walking, pretending I hadn't heard him. "Smart boy," he said, his voice now impossibly close, as though he were whispering in my ear. "But you can't ignore me forever." I didn't look back. By 5 a.m., the fatigue was setting in. My body ached, and my nerves were shot. Every noise, every flicker of movement sent my heart racing. That's when the whistling started again. It was louder this time, more insistent. The melody was off, like whoever was doing it couldn't quite remember the tune. It echoed through the square, bouncing off the buildings and making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I wasn't alone anymore. I could see a couple of the other workers huddled together near one of the giant screens, their brooms abandoned on the ground. They looked as terrified as I felt. "Do we run?" one of them called out to me. "No!" I shouted back. "Don't run!" The whistling grew louder, more frantic. It felt like it was burrowing into my brain, making it hard to think. One of the workers, a young guy who couldn't have been more than 19, panicked. He bolted, sprinting down the street with his arms flailing. "No!" I yelled, but it was too late. The shadows came for him instantly, rising up from the ground like a tidal wave. He didn't even make it 20 feet before they swallowed him whole. The whistling stopped. I staggered back, gripping my broom like it could somehow protect me. The remaining workers stared at me, their faces pale. "What do we do now?" one of them whispered. "Stick to the rules," I said, my voice shaking. "It's the only way." The rest of the shift was a blur. I kept sweeping, kept my head down, and avoided anything that seemed remotely out of place. The man in the suit didn't appear again, but I could feel his presence watching me from the shadows. By the time the sun started to rise, only about half of us were left. The square was still a mess, but none of us cared anymore. We just wanted to survive. At exactly 9 a.m., Steve reappeared, looking as calm and collected as ever. "Good job, everyone," he said, as though we'd just finished a normal night of work. "Good job?" I snapped. 3 people are dead." Steve raised an eyebrow. "I told you to follow the rules. The ones who didn't, well, that's on them." He handed out our checks like it was business as usual. I looked at the crisp $500 in my hand, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Was it worth it?" Steve asked, smirking. I glared at him. "I don't know what this place is, but I'm never coming back." "Most don't," he said with a shrug. "But hey, you survived. That's more than some can say." I walked away without another word, the weight of the night pressing down on me. Walking away from Times Square, I felt like I was escaping a war zone. The sun had fully risen, washing the streets with light, but it didn't feel comforting. Instead, it just illuminated the wreckage of what we'd been through. Discarded brooms, toppled trash cans, and a few scattered belongings that belonged to people who weren't walking out of there with us. The surviving workers shuffled toward the subway station, not speaking, their faces pale and haunted. Ben was gone. Jess was gone. The guy who bolted when the whistling started, gone. As for me, I clutched my check like it was the only proof that any of it had even happened. On the subway, I slumped into a seat and stared at the check. $500. I should have been thrilled. This was more money than I'd made in a single night in my life. But all I could think about were the shadows, the whistling, and the man in the suit. My phone buzzed. A text from my roommate. "How'd it go?" "Easy money, right?" I almost laughed. Instead, I texted back, "Yeah, real easy. You know, just had to dodge a few murderous shadows. Totally normal stuff." He responded with a string of laughing emojis. If only he knew. As the train screeched into my station, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. For a moment, I thought I saw him, the man in the suit, sitting behind me, his head tilted at that unnatural angle. I whipped around, but there was no one there, just an empty seat. I told myself it was the lack of sleep messing with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I got home, I shoved the check in a drawer and crawled into bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows or heard the whistling. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the alley where Jess disappeared. She was standing there, staring at me with empty eyes, her mouth moving silently. Behind her, the shadows writhed and reached for me. I woke up in a cold sweat and immediately decided that this was a one-and-done kind of job. $500 wasn't worth the nightmares, or the knowledge that the rules weren't there to keep us on task. They were there to keep us alive. A week later, I ran into Steve at a coffee shop. He was sitting at a corner table, looking less strung out than he had that night. "Well, if it isn't Daryl," he said with a grin. "How's life treating you?" "Better now that I'm not dodging shadows," I said, trying to keep my tone light. He chuckled and took a sip of his coffee. "You did good out there. Most people don't even make it through the first night." "That's comforting," I said dryly. Steve leaned in, his grin fading. You followed the rules, Daryl. That's why you're still here. But just a piece of advice. Don't talk about what you saw. Not to anyone. You won't like what happens if you do. Before I could respond, he stood up and walked out, leaving me with more questions than answers. I cashed the check the next day, spent it on groceries, paid off a bill or two, and saved the rest. But every time I looked at my bank balance, all I could think about was how many people didn't walk away with theirs. Would I take a gig like that again? Absolutely not. So, if you ever see a Facebook ad for a one-night cleaning job in Times Square, offering $500 for a few hours of work, do yourself a favor. Keep scrolling. Trust me, no amount of money is worth what's out there in the dark. Because when the lights go out and the crowds are gone, Times Square belongs to them.